you already think you know who the greatest warriors in history were, because movies, games, and school told you, and they got almost all of it wrong. Spartacus didn't fight to free all slaves. El Cid spent years fighting for Muslim rulers against Christian ones. Miyamoto Musashi may not have fought his most famous duel fairly. These aren't minor footnotes. They completely change who these people actually were, and they make the real story far more interesting than the legend. We're going through 6 warriors today. Each one gets the myth first, then the history, and by the end, you'll understand why every legend is really a mirror of what later societies needed to believe. Let's start with the one whose name became a symbol of freedom for every oppressed person in history, Spartacus. The Kubrick film from 1960 and the TV series built an image that basically everyone believes. Noble slave rebel, fights to free all enslaved people, dies heroically in one final battle. The problem is that the ancient sources, Plutarch and Appian, writing more than a century after Spartacus lived, give no indication at all that he had an ideological goal of abolishing slavery. Classicist Barry Strauss, who wrote the most thorough modern book on the revolt, argues that Spartacus's primary goal was to lead his followers out of Italy north over the Alps, back to their home regions. When his forces rejected that plan and turned south to raid Italy instead, it may be because many of them weren't enslaved gladiators at all. They were agricultural slave laborers who wanted to loot, not escape. The rebel force was also deeply split. 2 other leaders, Crixus and Oenomaus, both Gallic or Germanic, commanded large factions with completely different priorities. Crixus split from Spartacus and was killed in 72 BCE. That division weakened the whole rebellion significantly. As for the famous heroic death, Appian says simply that Spartacus was never found among the dead after the final battle of 71 BCE. His body was never identified. He may have died fighting, died before the final battle, or possibly escaped. No ancient source gives the dramatic last stand scene. What is credibly real? Spartacus defeated multiple Roman armies, including the forces of 2 consuls in 72 BCE, which was a genuine military embarrassment for Rome. He created improvised rope ladders from vines to descend the cliffs of Vesuvius and outflank a Roman blocking force. That's documented, and that's genuinely brilliant. His tactical intelligence is the most historically solid part of the legend. The freedom fighter ideology is what later generations layered onto him because they needed it. Now Miyamoto Musashi, the invincible samurai who fought 61 duels and never lost, carved a wooden sword from an oar, arrived late as psychological warfare. Almost none of this is verifiable. Musashi himself wrote in the Book of 5 Rings that he had over 60 contests and was never defeated. But he wrote this at the very end of his life as a first-person autobiographical claim with no corroboration. The number appears in no independent historical document from his lifetime. The main biographical source, the Nightingale Kai, was written decades after his death and tends strongly toward heroic mythologization. The most famous episode, the duel at Ganryu Island on April 13, 1612, against Sasaki Kajiro, is the murkiest of all. The popular version, Musashi arrived dramatically late, carved the wooden sword from his boat's oar on the way there, and killed Kajiro with a single blow. Historian William Scott Wilson, who has translated Musashi's works into English, has noted that the reliable documentation around this duel is surprisingly thin. Some historians have raised the serious question of whether Musashi arrived accompanied by students or allies, and whether Kajiro was actually beaten down by a group before Musashi administered the finishing blow. The wooden oar detail appears only in later sources, not in anything written at the time. The late arrival as psychological tactic is a literary embellishment from after the fact. The image of Musashi as a lone wandering swordsman is also only partially true. In the 1630s and 1640s, he lived as a guest of the Hasakawa domain in Kumamoto, where he had students. He was a serious painter, sculptor, and calligrapher, a man of genuine cultural sophistication, not a homeless drifter. He died peacefully in 1645, likely from thoracic cancer, completing his philosophical writings. He died like a scholar finishing his last book, not like a warrior in a final duel. The man and the myth are two completely different people. Now the warrior, the pop history world, consistently calls Africa's Napoleon Shaka Zulu. The challenge with Shaka is fundamental and has to be stated clearly. The primary written sources are European settlers, Henry Francis Finn, Nathaniel Isaacs, and James Stewart, all with limited and heavily biased perspectives. Historian Dan Wiley, in Myth of Iron, has argued extensively that the picture of Shaka is substantially distorted by colonial agendas, alternately demonizing him to justify conquest or romanticizing him as a noble savage. The verified core, Shaka was real. He was born around 1787, seized control of the Zulu chiefdom after his father's death around 1816, and was assassinated by his own half-brothers in September 1828. The famous chest and horns battle formation, the Izimpando Zankomo, is often credited entirely to Shaka. Military historians have found that his patron Dingaswayo and other Nguni chiefs were already developing these tactics. The innovation was evolutionary. Shaka refined and systematized an approach already in development. He didn't invent it from nothing. The short stabbing spear story has the same problem. Short stabbing spears existed before Shaka. What he appears to have done is standardize their use as a system, combined with a large cowhide shield. The death tolls attributed to Shaka's wars, the Mfecane, were long presented as evidence of catastrophic violence he personally caused. Scholar Julian Cobbing argued in the 1980s that this narrative was substantially constructed by European colonial historians to blame Africans for land that colonizers then claimed was empty and theirs to take. The accounts of Shaka becoming erratic and brutal after his mother Nandi's death in 1827 come primarily from Nathaniel Isaacs, whose reliability Wiley has directly challenged. What we can say with reasonable confidence: Shaka was a real military and political innovator who built a significantly expanded Zulu state. Everything beyond that needs to be held carefully. Now El Cid, and this one might be the biggest gap between legend and reality of any warrior on this list. The 1961 Charlton Heston film presents Rodrigo Diaz de Vivar as the perfect Christian knight, loyal to Spain, fighting to defend Christianity from Muslim invaders. The historical reality: after being exiled from Castile by King Alfonso VI in 1081, Rodrigo spent a significant portion of his career fighting for Muslim rulers against Christian ones. He served as a mercenary military commander for the Muslim Taifa King Al-Mu'tamin of Zaragoza, and then his successor. He fought and defeated Christian forces, including those of Castile, Aragon, and the Count of Barcelona, on behalf of his Muslim employers. This is not disputed. It is confirmed across both Arabic and Latin sources. The title El Cid comes from the Arabic Al-Sayyid, meaning the Lord, given to him by his Muslim allies and enemies as a mark of respect. Campidor comes from the Latin campi doctor, master of the battlefield, from the Christian tradition. He held honorific titles from both sides, which tells you almost everything about 11th century Iberian politics. Religious borders were not the fixed walls the Reconquista myth suggests. Rodrigo was a pragmatic warlord, not a crusading saint. When he conquered Valencia in 1094, he didn't hand it to Christian Spain. He ruled it as his own independent lord. He kept it for himself. The dead-on-horseback legend, his corpse strapped to his horse El Babieca, leading one final victory, has no support in contemporaneous sources. The Historia Rodrasai, the most reliable source, says simply that he died in Valencia in 1099. The horseback detail appears centuries later. What is credibly real? Rodrigo was never defeated in a pitched battle in his entire career, confirmed across both Arabic and Latin records. That is a genuinely remarkable military fact. Now Joan of Arc, and the popular image here is almost the opposite of what she actually did. The standard picture is a warrior saint, sword in hand, personally cutting through English lines through divine will and martial skill. Joan's own words in her 1431 trial transcript are unequivocal. When asked about her sword, she said she preferred to carry her standard rather than kill anyone, and that she had never personally killed anyone. Her standard pleased her 40 times more than a sword. That is her own testimony, not a modern revision. She was wounded twice, an arrow in the neck at Orleans and a wound to the thigh, which confirms she was present in the fighting and was not hiding behind the lines. But the role she actually played was inspirational and strategic, not personally combative. Professional soldiers, Jean de Dunois, La Hire, Gilles de Rais, planned and executed the military operations. Her contribution was her effect on morale, on French confidence after years of catastrophic defeat, and on the tempo and aggression with which French forces were now willing to fight. What makes her genuinely remarkable is the documented speed of events. A teenage, illiterate peasant girl from Domremy in Lorraine obtained an audience with the Dauphin, convinced his court to give her troops, and presided over the relief of Orleans, all within weeks. The French victories that followed, the capture of Jargeau, Meun-sur-Loire, Beaugency, the victory at Patay, are documented military facts. The speed of French recovery after her arrival is historically real. Finally, the ninja. And this one is almost entirely a fabrication of 1980s cinema and video games. The iconic black outfit comes from Japanese kabuki theater, where stagehands dressed in black were considered invisible by theatrical convention. Actual historical shinobi wore disguises appropriate to their mission: peasant clothes, merchant attire, monk's robes. The goal was to blend in, not stand out in a black suit in the middle of the night. Shuriken throwing stars are documented and real, but they were small distraction tools thrown to slow pursuit or create an opening. The idea that they reliably kill enemies at distance is entirely cinematic. The Bansen Shukai, one of the major surviving ninjutsu manuals from 1676, describes the primary roles of shinobi as espionage, information gathering, arson, and disruption of enemy operations. They were, in modern terms, closer to intelligence operatives and special forces than to assassins. The Iga and Koka regions, as documented centers of these schools, are historically real. Everything else has been heavily embellished. So here is what connects all 6 of these figures. Every one of them became a legend long after their death, shaped by the needs of whoever was doing the shaping. Spartacus became a freedom fighter because enslaved and oppressed people across history needed to believe that resistance was possible. El Cid became Spain's patron of chivalry centuries after his death, when Spain needed a unifying myth of Christian reconquest, not because he was one. Musashi became the perfect samurai philosopher partly because 20th century Japan needed exactly that symbol of disciplined, lone, undefeatable spirit. The flesh and blood fighters were messier, more self-interested, more constrained by circumstance, and almost always more interesting than the icons they became. Joan of Arc's trial transcript, the 1431 record of her interrogation before her execution, is one of the most astonishing documents in medieval history, and almost nobody reads it. She was 19 years old, facing a court full of trained theologians, and she held her own in debate for weeks. Without a lawyer, without prior preparation, in a foreign language, because the proceedings were in Latin and had to be translated. When asked whether she knew she was in God's grace, she answered, "If I am not, may God put me there, and if I am, may God keep me there." The theologians had no answer for that. Her 1456 nullification trial, held 25 years after her execution, gathered dozens of people who had known her personally to testify under oath. It is an extraordinary second data point on who she actually was. What emerges from both trial records is a person of remarkable psychological coherence, not a sword-swinging warrior saint, but something more unusual. A teenage girl who was absolutely certain of what she was supposed to do and would not be moved from it. Now here is the broader point that connects all 6 of these figures, because it matters beyond the trivia of who did what. Every one of these legends was deliberately shaped after the fact, often centuries after, by societies that needed a particular kind of hero. Spain needed El Cid to be a perfect Christian knight not in the 11th century, when he was alive and serving Muslim kings, but in the 15th and 16th centuries when the Spanish crown needed a founding myth of national Christian identity. Japan needed Musashi to be a lone, invincible philosopher-warrior in the 20th century, when the country was building a modern national identity around certain values of discipline and self-mastery. Spartacus has been claimed by abolitionists, by Marxists, by filmmakers, and by game designers, each version shaped by what that particular culture needed freedom to look like in that particular moment. The historical person is almost always less convenient, more contradictory, and more interesting than the icon. The icon is a mirror. The person was a human being, and that gap between the icon and the human is why the history is always worth going back to. If this changed how you see any of these names, there's a video on this channel that goes even deeper on one of them. The full story of how El Cid's legend was deliberately built by the Spanish crown centuries after his death. It's a completely different story from the one you just heard, and it's linked right above this video.